It's surprising to me that Tchaikovsky, after they went and tore up all of his stuff and threw it in the fire and got rid of it and banned it, then he was like, you know what? I'm going to go back and preserve all the old Russian chant. I feel like if I was Tchaikovsky,
Yeah,
I'd be like, you know what? I'm done with you people. What
yeah,
do you mean you're
yeah,
going to
yeah.
come and throw away all my stuff?
For whatever it's worth, Tchaikovsky was, a very complex person and had a complicated life in many respects, but he clearly the church had a very important place in his life. And some of his writings, and he wrote letters voluminously to not only to Nadezhda von Meck, who was his patroness. You can get a pretty good sense of his mindset from these letters. And where he writes about church and church music, you could tell that it was a subject very close to his heart. And he said, what Russian church music needs is a messiah that's going to strip away all this foreign accretion and all of this, German and Italian stuff, which some of it was, Bortnyansky was a good composer, but he had a lot of imitators who were not so good composers. And so there was a lot of stuff that was out there that was sort of, second, third rate music. But Tchaikovsky said, don't imagine that I mean my own works. He said, this Messiah, that's going to be somebody else. And the general agreement is that was Kastalsky.
I'm publishing this podcast in partnership with the Orthodox Arts Journal and New World Byzantine. The Orthodox Arts Journal is an online resource where you can find articles about Orthodox iconography, architecture, and music from some of the foremost pioneers in the field, such as Aidan Hart, Vladimir Morosan, and Jonathan Pajot. New World Byzantine is the architectural design firm run by Andrew Gould, who in my estimation is the foremost Orthodox architectural designer in North and South America, bringing together a marriage of American design and traditional Orthodox building arts. Well, hello everyone. Today I'd like to welcome Vladimir Morosan. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
To get your name right, it's Vladimir Morosan.
Vladimir Morosan, just like Jim Morrison.
Okay.
My kids used to joke that it's we're distantly related, but we changed the spelling to protect our privacy.
That's great.
But actually, it's a very made up name. It's not a real name because of what Russian refugees and POWs had to go through in order to protect their lives. So my father had to change his name to not be Russian, to not be considered instantly Russian, because the name was Morozov, and that's quintessentially Russian.
Interesting. So he was from Russia.
Yeah, he's from Russia.
Wow. But you've been here your whole life.
Yes. I was born in Germany and came here as a 5-week infant.
Wow.
And grew up in Los Angeles.
So I talked to Andrew Gould, and he said, oh, for sure you have to have Vladimir on because he knows everything that there is to know about every style of Russian chant.
Well, we'll see if I know as much as I'm given credit for, but yeah, I know a few things.
Yes.
Yeah. Andrew was here not too long ago. Here being Southern California, San Diego area, and hopefully in a few years he'll be building us a church here.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. He does great work. And so you run Musica Russica, right?
Yes, that's a company I founded 1987. So yeah, we're almost coming up on our 40th anniversary.
Wow. Yeah, and why should people know Musica Russica? I mean, I can tell a little bit, but what would you say is your, 20-second sales pitch for buy your music from Musica Russica?
Yes, what uh, Musica Russica was established basically to make accessible the great Russian choral repertoire. And by accessible, I mean accessible to non-Russians, accessible to
Mm.
Western performers. Uh, when we were starting out, first of all, there was still communism in Russia. I mean, it was in the Soviet Union. It was still on it. It was kind of on its last legs, but 1987 still. And so there was a question of access. There was no uh, sacred music being published in any way, shape, or form.
Wow.
Uh, Plus, the obvious obstacle or barrier was the Cyrillic alphabet, since the Russian church uses Church Slavonic, and that's written in Cyrillic, even in the modern day Cyrillic, but most Western choir singers don't know how to read Cyrillic. And so,
I for sure do not know how to read Cyrillic,
right,
so
right. But actually, both Russian and Church Slavonic are eminently singable languages. And so, if one comes up with a proper phonetic transliteration, that all of a sudden opens that repertoire up. And so
I see.
that's what we started out doing, and are still doing it to a certain extent. Although we've got quite a lot of publications already in our catalog, and choirs are discovering this repertoire and singing it in the original language, which kind of aligns with the modern day approach to performance. You want to do things in the original language, and so we make that possible. And in
Sure.
addition, we also offer uh, diction coaching uh, tracks that where I speak the text, and so they choirs can buy one of these downloads and distribute it to their singers, and so they can come already with some mastery of the text.
And you have a fair amount of new compositions on there as well, right?
Well, we try to we have tried to recognize the work of modern day, in some cases living, in some cases recently deceased Russian composers. Of course, until the fall of communism, they didn't write sacred music openly. They wrote it, to use the expression, into the desk drawer,
Mm.
writing something knowing that it would not be published. And in fact, if they took it to the official music publishers, they could harm their career
Wow.
in the Soviet times. That would be considered a major stripe against them. And whenever the periodic uh, purge of ideological purge of creative artists would come up, this would certainly be noticed that, hey, you wrote a sacred piece. What's the matter? Are you wouldn't be possibly a Christian believer, would you? And I mean, history was full of those kinds of dynamics that happen to people, much to the detriment of their career. And so this was already in the survival DNA, so to speak. You want to be a survivor under the Soviet system, you just stay away from sacred music. As a performer, as a composer, as a scholar, you just don't go there.
Mm-hmm.
So we're living now in an era since 1990, around the time of the fall of communism, where there's been somewhat of a resurgence of interest, and certainly lots of churches opening up, and church choirs being reestablished. But interestingly enough, there hasn't been there's quite a lot of composition going on, but nothing that really, one might say, picks up where Rachmaninoff left off before 1917. There hasn't been any kind of obvious major figure. There's Georgy Sviridov, of course, but Georgy Sviridov he was one of these composers who wrote things into the desk drawer, and has some lovely sacred works that we've published.
Okay, wow. Yeah. There seems to be something interesting there, right? With like there was a huge amount of antipathy towards Christianity from the Soviet regime, of course, and trying to stamp it all out. But it seems like there must have been a huge amount of cultural memory at the same time, because I remember reading Rostropovich talking about Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony. I believe it was his fifth, and evidently in the slow movement, he quotes all these different requiems, including, like, I think he's quoting Znamenny chant, but he's also quoting Rachmaninoff and Tchaikovsky, and I think he even like makes reference to like Stravinsky's Requiem. But evidently, the people picked up on it because by the end of this movement, they were all weeping, and then of course, Rostropovich claimed that had the applause not been longer than the performance of the piece itself, then Shostakovich might have ended up being executed for the piece. But, you know, others have called that into question whether that's so or not. I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
I can't recall the exact music and the exact movement that you're referring to, so I'm just gonna I won't comment. But what you're saying specifically about that, but certainly, yeah, there was this there was a resistance, if you will, certainly among the educated intellectual class. There was a resistance to the communist ideology, to atheism, and of course, people were very well aware that the great legacy of Russian civilization and culture was grounded in orthodoxy, and many people were even during the height of communism were secretly baptized by their grandmother, for example. Not by the government, certainly. Sorry, by their grandparents, and perhaps brought up in some way in the church, or had icons in their house. Maybe they were hidden somewhere and were only brought up on certain occasions when it was safe to do so. But and in the 1970s and the 1980s, composers, well, a number of names come to mind. Certainly Arvo Pärt, who is openly a Orthodox Christian believer. People like Alfred Schnittke, Rodion Shchedrin, wrote. They looked for ways to draw upon that heritage of orthodoxy. Sviridov, whom I mentioned, in the late 1960s, wrote music for a historic play. Well, the play was set back in the 17th, late 16th, early 17th century, and so at the appropriate moment, there's a setting of Bogorodice Deva, Rejoice, O Virgin, the Ave Maria. Well, it's music for a play, you see. It's music for a historic play. Yeah, and that kind of tension existed then, through the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, and some really lovely works have been written by composers going to that particular approach of composition.
Yeah, that's interesting. So they kind of write something that would be church related, but they could claim that it's not church related. Sort of like the what is it, the Thou art the vineyard in Georgian chant. They're like, oh, it's just a wedding piece,
Right,
But then it also sort of became like a symbol for this is Georgia,
Yes, yes. Well, it's sung. It's been adapted to the text of the True Requiem, for example. In fact, we sang it on yesterday
Oh,
at the
really?
service. Yeah,
Yeah, I know some Georgians are like, why would you sing a cherubikim to that? We have our own cherubikims,
Right,
because it's
right.
a pretty melody. It's gorgeous. That's why.
Well, not only that, actually have heard Georgian choirs sing it as the
Really?
cherubic hymn. Yeah, so that's
Okay.
yeah. But there are purists. There are purists who
Yeah.
say that Georgian music should only be sung by Georgians in the context of worship.
Hmm.
Georgian sacred music, obviously.
Yeah. Fair enough. Hey, hit that like button. I'd love to ask you a little bit more about chant specifically.
Yes,
So this
ask
may
away.
be, so this may be a very a cursory summary of my understanding of Russian chant, and then maybe you can tell me the big areas that I'm totally missing. Right. So I just talked to Father Nicholas Mihaly,
Yes.
who's a big proponent of Carpatho-Russian chant. Um, and it is pretty evident the Carpatho-Russian sing with tons of vigor, and the congregation is just belting it out, and so I get there's an appeal to it. I also know plenty of people who are not the biggest fans of Carpatho-Russian chant, but in reading his thesis on Carpatho-Russian chant, he sort of made the case that, well, the Carpatho-Russian chant originally goes back to Byzantine chant, because Byzantine chant was the type of chant that would have been brought into the Slavic lands, and then that becomes Znamenny chant. And so Znamenny chant is basically Byzantine chant, but it's adopted to the Slavic peoples and to their language. And then eventually this becomes Znamenny with square notation, and then eventually the square notation, which is actually after pneumatic notation. So first it's like Znamenny with pneumatic notation, then eventually square notation, and then from that, then you get the prostopenie. And the prostopenie is sort of like, improvised harmonies with this base of Znamenny chant for like the people of Carpatho-Russia. So I guess my first question would be, is Znamenny chant really the base for all Russian forms of chant? And then, I know there's like Kievan chant and Obikhod chant, which I'm wondering if those are technically the same thing. Because I was reading your article on Orthodox Arts Journal. It seems like they're kind of synonymous. And
Yes.
then, what are the other major forms of Russian chant? So that's like three
Okay.
big questions, but
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah. Well, I think the overall outline that you presented, uh, if one goes back far enough, and of course the baptism of Rus, of Kiev and Rus, happened in 988 A.D. Great Prince Vladimir of Kiev was the my patron saint, was the person responsible for that, and at that time, yes, the Byzantine liturgy and Byzantine chant, of course, in its early medieval state, uh, was fairly well formed, and the Greeks from Constantinople sent missionaries to Kiev, and clergy and hierarchy and chanters. There is some suggestion that actually these chanters were not Greeks, but that they were Bulgarians. And Bulgaria had been Christianized a couple of centuries prior to that, but the language would have been already somewhat adapted to Cyrillic,
Okay.
translated from Greek into Slavic, again in its prototypical ancient form, which took place somewhere, originated. I was reading the Slavs as a people, as a tribe. Uh, it is said that they arose somewhere in what is now Slovenia, perhaps not not coincidentally, that name, and from there Slavs went south to Serbia and Bulgaria, Macedonia. They went north to like the Czechia and Slovakia, and they went east to Kievan Rus and what eventually became Muscovy, and Russia grew up on that basis. So and these changes, scholars have somewhat of a challenge in drawing direct lines. It's a little bit like the tunnel image. There's into the tunnel goes Byzantine chant, and then a couple of centuries later, the train comes out of the tunnel, and it's known as Znamenny chant, but it's already been substantially transformed. And what happened in that tunnel, in part, is the reason we don't know as much is it had to do with the Tatar invasions and the Mongols, the Mongol horde, as it was called, and the destruction of most every single Russian city at the time, starting with like 1237, 1238. These invasions, the cities were made out of wood, the churches were made out of wood, manuscripts are in parchment or birch bark, and all of this stuff goes up in flames. And only in 14th, late 14th, 15th century do we start getting another wave of cultural, of certain amount of stability and cultural renaissance, if you will, and with the building, for example, in Moscow now they're building churches in stone, inviting Italian architects to Moscow. The famous Aristotle Fioravanti, who built the Dormition Cathedral in the Kremlin, which is still standing. And the dedication of that cathedral goes back to 1479. So already there we can talk about, we know that there was a choir established, the oldest choir with a kind of a continuous history was the choir of the Dormition Cathedral in Moscow. And that became later it became the Imperial Chapel. And then with the coming of the Patriarchate, the establishment of the Patriarchate in Moscow, the Patriarch also got a choir. And so the patriarchal singers became the Moscow Synodal Choir, a very famous choir that was active around the late 19th, early 20th century, and premiered all these great works that the world knows now as the Russian school. So those roots go very deeply, and yes, so the chant grew out of what is basically called Znamenny chant, and the regions in the what was from the standpoint of Kievan Rus was far west, the Carpathian Mountains. That was never strictly part of Kievan Rus, but it was surrounded by other nations, other nationalities, many of them non-Slavic. Eventually it became part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and which was, of course, officially Roman Catholic. And so these Carpatho-Russians were, while maintaining very strong kind of ties, religious and cultural to Russia, they were surrounded by sort of hostile powers who were trying to convert them to Roman Catholicism, and that's where you have the concept of the unia, the uniates.
Right. The Greek Catholics, right?
The Greek Catholics, so-called, yeah. And but yeah, there have been studies made, and these are kind of interesting musicological studies for those people who are interested in that sort of thing, to trace common roots of melodies that probably arose from the same roots, as it were. in what became Carpatho-Russian Prostopinia, and then became Znamenny chant, Kievan chant, and Kievan chant. It's basically a kind of somewhat abbreviated version of Znamenny chant. Znamenny chant existed in at least two, perhaps three levels of complexity. There was the very melodic chant, very ornamented, very melismatic. Then there was a kind of a middle of the ground chant that was still rather melodic in its nature, but tending more to the syllabic rather than extremely melismatic. And then there was the so-called lesser chant or little chant, and the little chant was much more. It was probably intended for use in like on daily services, ferial services that are not festal, so simple and tending much more to recitative. So there would be a little formula at the beginning, and then a passage of recitative, and a cadence formula at the end, and out of that grew up Kievan chant, which then became common in its use, commonly used chant, and that's what Obikhod means. Obikhod is things that you are commonly using kind of on a daily basis.
Okay, because maybe I'm wrong in this. Because one of my best friends is an Orthodox choir director, but I'm not an Orthodox choir director. But sometimes I go and sing in the choir. If I go to a Vespers or something,
Right.
And I feel like I've seen music that'll say Kievan tone 4, or it'll say Obikhod tone 4.
Mm-hmm.
Are they sometimes used separately, like in American parlance, or is that relatively synonymous? It's just like different.
Yeah, it has to
Publications.
do a little bit. Yeah, it has to do with what publication you're using, or if it's someone's handwritten material. Uh, the church in America is still young. The Orthodox Church, well, America is still young too, by standards of Orthodox cultures. America is very young. And of course, the official beginning of Orthodoxy in America usually is traced to the Alaskan missionaries who came in 1794, not too long after the establishment of America. Of course, at that time, Alaska was a Russian colony. So, but that's where that came came from. And the monks who came over there as missionaries brought over the kind of singing that they knew in their monastery back in Russia. And it was probably some form of Kievan chant, or perhaps Valam Monastery in the northwest of Russia, near Finland.
And that's different than Kievan chant.
Well, again, it's a regional variant. It's a regional variant of Znamenny chant. Yeah, and if it, I mean, the fact that in 1909, I want to say, or 1905, the monks of Valam they collected their chant and codified it and published it in a nicely bound volume with actually in round notation, which is very accessible. That became known as Valam chant. But if you look deeply, and those kinds of studies, there's a few that have been done, but there's still lots to study in that regard. We could say that, oh look, this is how they sang this in this monastery, and this is how they sang this in that monastery, and look at the relation, look at the close relation. But what it really amounts to is a way of delivering text, and a way of heightening text in kind of to a more solemn degree. So in our ancestors' thinking, if you want to solemnize, if you will, make a word or a phrase particularly elevated in its expression, you make it melismatic. You put a big melisma on some important word, like God, or Christ, at Easter, Pascha, the word Pascha, which means Easter, Passover. You put a big melisma on it, and then once these kinds of uses get established, then you get the opportunity to make connections. So you use this melisma, which is known on this word, you use it in another hymn, and that gives the listener an association. And all of this is very, very, I think, was very intricately and artistically developed in the evolution of Znamenny chant from the Byzantine. Certain principles were used, of course, that are common, but there are some very important distinctions between the way the Byzantine chant was organized and the way Znamenny chant was organized.
And what are some of those differences?
Well, perhaps the most striking difference is the fact that Byzantine chant uses a system of modes which are contrasting or different one from another in their intervallic relationship. So you have as John Michael Boyer was explaining to you, the scale Nipavu Gadi, and which is like do re mi fa sol. Interestingly, which was used by Russian chanters, do re mi was ut re mi fa sol was very well known in the chant culture of Russia, and but and of course in the Byzantine system, these various modes each have their own kind of character and ethos. In Russian use, and I use Russian kind of loosely to cover the whole Eastern Slavic realm. Okay, the name Russia, offends some people because they say, well, no, we're Ukrainian, or we're Belarusian, or we're this or that. But Kievan Rus, and it's Russian. I think that would be a little bit artificial to say the Russian. No, it's Russian. It's derived from Rus, okay?
Right.
And all those people were from Rus initially. So the Russian system it does not use different scales. It has one scale only, which is comprised of successive tetrachords, one after another, or trichords, depending on how you look at it. But so you have essentially what amounts to a diatonic scale. And
now, when I was talking, sorry to interrupt, when I was talking to Father Mihaly, he said in the Carpatho-Russian chant they didn't have sevenths. Like it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 octave, and there basically was no seventh. Now, is that just, before you keep going, is that just Carpatho-Russian, or is that really like all of Znamenny chant?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what he meant by that. Yes, in the single hymn, it has to do with the range, and hymns tend to be more, they're sometimes quite limited in the overall range, because it has to do with a lot of internal kind of movement, circling around a certain note, a certain pitch, and the movement. Yes, a melody would begin in a certain tetrachord and exploit all those possible movements within that tetrachord, and then maybe at some point it will modulate, if you will, to a higher tetrachord, and that then brings in the use of those four tones in four pitches into the gamut of the melody. But what was the point I was trying to make about the distinction between Byzantine and Znamenny, is that there is still a system of 8 tones, like the octoichos, as it's called in Orthodox parlance. So the octoichos, but the tones are differentiated one from another by different means, not by changing the scale, but by the selection of melodic formulas that are associated with a particular tone.
Okay.
Okay. Now that all sort of recedes into the background because there was a major upheaval in the mid to late 17th century with the schism of the old believers, and that's an event that probably we should mention a little bit more extensively. So
And that's what the liturgical reforms of Patriarch Nikon,
yes,
right? And
yes,
then there were a bunch of people who said, "No, no, no, this is just a bunch of trivial nonsense. We must cross ourselves with 2 fingers."
exactly, exactly.
And so then,
So yeah, it the Russian Church never experienced anything comparable to a Reformation. In fact, Orthodoxy in general has not had Reformation. But there have been
fair enough.
major fractures, and the fracture that happened in the latter half of the 17th century was, I think, every bit as radical and violent in some cases as the Reformation was a few centuries prior to that in the Western Church. So you have this, you have an attempt to kind of update certain liturgical practices, to update the texts, to correct the texts, because when you have lots of scribes writing, errors creep in and stuff like that. So there was this major attempt by Patriarch Nikon to correct the books and correct the practices, and saying, it is not correct for you to be crossing yourself with 2 fingers, but you have to use 3 fingers. And yes, a whole group of people who were arguably probably not literate. I mean, they were very literate in the sort of in the practices of the faith, but they were not book literate, if you know what I mean. And so for them to be told that, no, you have to use 3 fingers and not 2 fingers, and you have to process around the church counterclockwise and not clockwise, or they said with the sun or against the sun, because the sun goes this way in the sky, right? I guess it's clockwise, and so they thought before the reforms that yes, you should also process, and Orthodoxy has lots of processions around where you circumnavigate the church. You would go with the sun, and Patriarch Nikon said, no, that's incorrect. You have to go in the other direction from right to left. Okay, and so those people, and there were major layers of the population, culturally speaking, who were so very much steeped in that they could not accept those reforms. And then a few leading clergymen came along and exploited that sentiment, whatever their motivations were. And so that's where the so-called old believers or old ritualists came about. A lot of them were persecuted. Some were executed. Many of them fled and Russia is a big country, and so they would go to the far reaches of Siberia, or some went to Turkey, some went to Western Europe, and then there are even groups that ended up in the New World. There's a group in Brazil, there's a group in Mexico, there's a group in Oregon, there's a group in Alaska, and one in Erie, Pennsylvania, very well known in our American context, because in part because they The head of that community, Father Theodore Yurevich, is a very renowned iconographer, and he has painted many churches in absolutely stunning, splendid fashion. That Erie in that sense. And the other interesting thing about Erie is they have completely converted to worshiping in English, whereas some of the other communities preserved, along with their Znamenny chant, they preserved Church Slavonic. Whereas in Erie, they've completely gone to English and transcribed the entire cycle of chants, translated them into English, and
are the ones in Erie, have they come back in? Because wasn't there like a big rapprochement between the Old Believers and the canonical Orthodox Church?
Well, there were
kind of
yeah.
brought back in.
I'm not sure. I'm actually not sure. I think the community in Erie is under the Russian Church outside Russia, Rokor, so-called Rokor. But they, in fact, there was a bishop, Daniel, who was an architect, and he's responsible for building a beautiful cathedral in Washington, D.C., the St. John the Baptist, where Rostropovich, whom you mentioned earlier, actually was a parishioner there and contributed to the bells. They have beautiful bells there. Which are, to the scandal of many, rung by an electric carillon mechanism, not the real way you're supposed to ring them.
Not with one string on the thumb and one string on the pinky.
Exactly. The Russian bells are fixed; they don't swing, so they're fixed to the belfry, and they're rung by means of ropes that are connected in some cases to the arms, in some cases to foot pedals, and one skilled ringer can winds up playing the whole set. And of course, if it's an extremely big belfry, then there might be two ringers. But that's another skill that is very well developed in Orthodoxy. So where were we? The Old Believers. They maintained then not only the some of these rites that we were talking about, but also they maintained the Znamenny chant, and they maintained it in its monophonic form.
Right, so and you were saying the Bishop Daniel was the one in D.C. Did he bring a lot of the Old Believers into Rokor?
I don't know exactly. I'm not sure. I do know that he
that was like a big thing, wasn't it? Because they've been out of communion for like 300 years and
right. There were
not had priests or something. I remember reading about it, and it was fascinating. They were like, we can't have the sacraments because the priesthood is dead.
Yeah.
So they just didn't have them.
There were two major divisions among the Old Believers, two major categories. There were the priestless ones and the priested ones. So the priestless ones are the ones that you are thinking about who didn't have any sacraments because they didn't have any ordained clergy. And in fact, in the church, an Orthodox church has this setup where the church is divided into three major areas, kind of paralleling the setup of the Old Testament temple. You had the narthex, which was the courtyard, and then you had the sanctuary, or the nave, and then you had the altar, the Holy of Holies. Well, and between the nave and the altar is a big screen of icons, a little bit like what you have as your backdrop there, but all arranged. And of course, there's the doors, the royal gates, as they're called, or the beautiful gates in between. And you have icons that are very traditionally set up according, in the different places and iconostas. Well, the priestless Old Believers had no altar. So they had the icon screen that literally and symbolically led nowhere. It was just a
Interesting.
wall. It was just a wall.
Wow.
I mean, the symbolism of that is stunning. Just what that must have been like, because the Orthodox Church, the Christian Church, is very sacramental. From baptism to burial, it's all a sacrament. It's that time where believers in very consistent fashion every Sunday, every liturgy, they intersect with the heavenly realm, which the church is intended to be. It's a replica of the throne room of God, which is referred to in the book of Revelations too. There's all this symbolism that could go on and on and on about. But then there were the group of priesthood old believers that somehow managed to maintain some type of hierarchy and some form of sacraments. And in fact, in the 18th century and the 19th century and the 20th century, there were various attempts by the official church to have some form of rapprochement. They were kind of invited back into under various conditions. Like you don't have to renounce all your practices. You're not going to be considered heretics. We'll let you kind of do your thing in peace.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, you might be thinking of another event where there was rapprochement, if you will, and that was in 2007 when ROCOR reunited sacramentally with the Church of Moscow uh, after the revolution in 1917. There was a rupture of communion, and there was
Okay.
infiltration by some accounts of the hierarchy in the Soviet Union by um, clergy who were very sympathetic to the communist regime, and um, that's just an area that one doesn't even want to go into because there's a lot of hearsay and innuendo. But there were issues that people who had fled for their lives to the West to escape communist persecution, they just say we cannot maintain sacramental unity with people who are getting along just fine with the atheist communists.
Mm-hmm.
And so in 2007, finally that rupture was um, healed to a certain extent, not 100%, and now some people are having buyer's remorse
Mm.
for political reasons that it's just as well for us not to go into here.
Fair enough. Yeah, Father John Parker said he told me that in Russia you basically had four types of Orthodox priests during the whole communist regime. You had those who were corrupt. You had those who were partially corrupt, but they figured it was better to be a little bit corrupt to keep the doors of the church open. Then you had those who fled and went somewhere else if they could, and then you had those who were martyred. And those are basically, you know, so it's kind of a
Yeah,
mixed
and
bag.
and 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 what's ironic about that is that even those who decided to get along with the communists were eventually martyred,
Yeah.
as were communists, good faithful card
Right.
carrying communists. They were eventually killed as well.
The
So
revolution eats itself.
that's right, and the kind of ideology that communism is, the way it has shown itself in time and time again in Russia and China and Vietnam and Cambodia and Cuba and Venezuela. I mean, it's all the same. It just you know he
Not
who
good.
he who has ears, let them hear.
Indeed. For sure. So I did not know that the old believers were two different groups. I didn't realize there was a priested versus an unpriested version.
Hmm.
Um, is the priestless version, were some of them also brought into Rokor, or you don't
I
know?
don't know. I think if there are priestless communities still, they tend to be very isolated and keep to themselves. And I really don't know much about their current state, but I do know. Uh, yeah, I mean, I can. I imagine there were times when a priestless community might say, you know, brothers, it's enough for us to be separate like that. Let's go to those priested old believers over there and see if we can work out some kind of union so that we can again partake of the sacraments and so I imagine there are lots of individual cases of that kind of thing.
Sure. That's super wild and apocalyptic to believe. We're at the end. Our church is sacramental, but our church no longer exists. Therefore, we have no sacraments, no bishops, no priests. It's like, man, what a crazy
Yeah, yeah. Well,
apocalyptic version of yourself.
yeah, and certainly there were times. I mean, Peter, the so-called great, it went down in history as the great, but to them he was the Antichrist. I mean, very, and you can imagine that if you proclaim the sovereign czar to be the Antichrist, it's not going to go well with you.
Yeah, probably not.
Right. Unless you're so far away that
Doesn't really
that
matter.
that he doesn't reach you. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but what they kept alive, the monophonic form, right? This
Right.
is
Right.
so. Whereas due to the a little bit of westernizing tendency after some of the reforms, and like you said, Peter the Great, they started experimenting with polyphonic singing and more of a choral sense, whereas the old believers kept alive the monodic Znamenny chant.
Right.
Is that correct?
Right. That's correct. But more so, one has to recognize that kind of on the heels of that schism of the old believers, there was even before Peter, with Peter's father, Tsar Alexis, there was a major watershed that occurred in Russian chant, and that's one reason why it's uh, somewhat difficult to talk about Russian chant as one kind of phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, you had the the melismatic monophonic chant, and you also had polyphony, starting in the 16th century and going to the end of the 17th century, several forms of indigenous Russian polyphony that doesn't sound like anything that you can imagine. It's a polyphony based, how Western polyphony is largely based. You could say it's triadic in its nature, and consonant
Mm-hmm.
triads. This is polyphony that's based on fourths and fifths superimposed with the resulting dissonances of seconds, major seconds, minor seconds, and it's a totally different soundscape than we can
Is
imagine
so it's akin to like Georgian chant.
in some respects, and that's but as to where it came from is still scholars are still puzzling that one out.
Okay.
Could it have come from Georgia? It could have. It could have, but we're talking 16th century. How much, it's not like, I mean, right now we could dial up an album by, the Russian Patriarchate Choir and listen to this polyphony. Um, in the 16th century, it wasn't so easy, to go to the Caucasus and bring Georgian style singing to Moscow. It was a very long ways away, and
Interesting.
so exactly how it came to be, and then it kind of as it arose again, sometime in the 16th, flourished in the 17th century. Then in the latter half of the 17th century, it gets supplanted by consonant Western style polyphony, based on
Interesting.
consonant triads and somewhat functional harmony. And that we do know where that came from, because that came largely from Poland and Lithuania, which were Roman Catholic kingdoms. Or at one time there was the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom. It was one big entity that occupied a good portion of Eastern Europe. It was all one kingdom, and so they and part of that movement to bring the Orthodox under Rome in the Unia. There was one notable attempt in 1598 or 1596, the Unia of Brest, Litovsk, and so there was a kind of movement that if Orthodox people went to a church that used, let's say, Western Renaissance polyphony or early Baroque polyphony, there seemed to be an attraction. People preferred that sound, but these people are Roman Catholics. We can't do that. But then some of the Orthodox clergy said, no, well, we can adopt and adapt that kind of music to our services, and then at least there will be one less reason for our people to go to the Uniates. So then that type of polyphony made its way to Kiev, and from Kiev it went northeast to Muscovy. And Patriarch Nikon, in addition to all the other stuff that he was doing, was very, very fond of this type of singing. So he invited the singers, like ensembles, we know whole groups they were usually numbered 12 in a group, and these 12 groups of 12 singers would go to Muscovy, and they would sing for the Tsar, and they would sing for the Patriarch and ask for employment and be granted employment. Or if the Tsar wouldn't employ them, some nobleman would employ them. It was all about following the fashion of the court. There was a lot of that going on, and then later in the 18th century, when the Italian style came into St. Petersburg, all the nobility, we want to be just like the court in St. Petersburg, so we're going to have our own capellas, as they were called, our own choirs, patterned after the court choir and singing the same kind of music that they were singing. So these stylistic changes happened largely at the following the trends and the fashion of the imperial court.
But without that, you don't get some of the great Russian choral stuff, right? Like Tchaikovsky and Chesnikov and Bortniansky and
Yeah.
Golovanov.
Right.
However you say Golovanov or
Golovanov.
Golovanov. Yes.
Yeah. We'll use this opportunity to set the record straight on some of those pronunciations. Yeah. You're right. Exactly. On the plus side, we can say that out of that grew the great Russian, what's known as the great Russian choral school, or the New Direction. The New Direction being what was new about it? Well, so in the late 18th century, and even before that, there was this wholesale importation of first kind of Polish Baroque style singing, then with a composer, for example, Vasily Titov, who was of Titov, who wrote these magnificent 12-part concertos for well, it's not exactly it's not exactly the Venetian style, but it's a kind of a late Baroque adaptation of the Venetian style, where you have
Interesting.
three groups. Well, either you have the like three soprano parts, three alto parts, three tenor parts, three bass parts, um, concertizing in that sense of concertato, uh, uh, struggling against each other, right, or
Okay.
competing with each other. Yeah, that's what concertare means, right? Is to compete, uh, and then that was followed by the Italian style. And Bortniansky was, since you mentioned his name, he was a very precocious 6 or 7 year old when he was brought from Gluchov, which was a village in Ukraine that supposedly had lots of excellent boy singers. There was a school there for them, and they were recruited, the best ones were recruited to sing in the Imperial Chapel. So then when Bortniansky grew up a little bit, they sent him to Italy. He spent 10 years in Italy learning to write Italian opera, and came back to St. Petersburg, and that's what he did, in addition to being appointed the head of the Imperial Chapel. And he proceeded to make that an exemplary choral establishment with the best Italian school vocal training, with nurturing the boys in the best techniques of bel canto, and out of that, for the most of the 19th century, the Imperial Chapel was an exemplary choir in Europe. So much so that by hearsay, again, at the time, no recordings at that time, but anyone who heard, we have accounts by Berlioz, by Schumann, visitors to St. Petersburg, Adolphe Adam, and then the King of Prussia sending what amounted to industrial espionage. He sent an ambassador to St. Petersburg whose job was to basically report on how is it that the Imperial Chapel of the Russian Tsar is so excellent, and bring that information back to Berlin so we can have the same kind of Domchor in Berlin as the Russian Tsar has in St. Petersburg. But all the stylistically, that music was practically, very little to distinguish it from contemporaneous music of the late Baroque, early classical, Viennese classical, Italian classical, however you want to classify that.
Was it somewhat based on Znamenny?
No, no,
Not at all. So
not at all,
Bortniansky has like
not at
no
all.
real continuity with
No,
old Russian chant.
very little, very little. There are 10 pieces by Bortniansky where he made attempts to harmonize, because that was the thing to do. You take a chant and now you have to sing it in 4-part harmony. So he harmonized, he arranged 10 pieces out of a very large. Otherwise, I think his total number of works is in about over 100. So these 10 pieces, some say, well, he was kind of pointing the way where Russian church music should be going. In other words, it should eventually shed all this Western foreign style and learn how to work through the Znamenny and other melodies that are much older in 4-part harmony. And there were several composers that followed suit, but it was still, the rules of part writing, the harmonic vocabulary that was used was very, very much Western. Well, along came Tchaikovsky and those who followed him. And Tchaikovsky, in part, first he wrote a liturgy that was completely freely composed, kind of out of his imagination, and he caught flack for it. People said, well, he's treating the Divine Liturgy like an opera libretto. He's just taking the words and setting them to music. But then after that, and just as an aside, the director of the Imperial Chapel tried to ban Tchaikovsky's liturgy.
Really?
Yeah, and
Maybe
actually,
it's anathema, but I must say I do like it. It is a
well,
gorgeous piece of music.
it's a lovely piece of music, but at one point they sent the gendarmes into the music stores, if you can imagine, and basically made a bonfire of Tchaikovsky's liturgy. So, but 5 years later, in 1882, Tchaikovsky wrote his all-night vigil, where he very consciously went back to the square note chant books, which hardly anybody was using at that time. Well, they were probably using it in the village churches in the countryside, but certainly not in the capital cities. And so, and then he wrote his all-night vigil, which is entirely comprised of harmonized, not so much Znamenny. There are a few Znamenny melodies, but Kievan and something called Russian Greek chant, which people get confused because the word in Russian is Grеческий meaning Greek, so Greek, but doesn't mean it was.
What is Russian Greek chant?
Well, it's a chant that is maybe got some inspiration from living under the Ottomans was not a great time for if you were Orthodox, whether you were in Greece or in Bulgaria or Serbia. It was terrible things what the Ottomans did to the church. And so one can imagine that from time to time, some enterprising chanter or group of chanters would say, why are we suffering here under the Ottomans? Let's go. There's this great Orthodox empire up north. Let's go there and let's see if we can get some sort of, employment there perhaps. And so there is some evidence that in the somewhere probably in the 17th century that there were some Greek chanters that went up north, and from their singing, which was written down by Russian chanters, all right, and already diatonicized, if you will, that we have this thing called Russian Greek chant. In my editions, I always label Russian, quote, Greek chant, because it's not Greek chant, it's Russian Greek chant. A very important difference. But if you sing some of those melodies and you put an ison to it, drone, you say, yeah, that could be. I can see where that would be Byzantine. Could have come out of Byzantine.
Original Znamenny, which comes from Byzantine.
Yeah.
But then there's also Byzantine chant affecting Russian chant in the 17th century from people coming from Byzantium under the Ottoman Empire.
Possibly.
And
then there's something called
Russian Greek chant.
Yeah, and then there's something called Russian Bulgarian chant. Also, some Bulgarian scholars will tell you that this is ancient, authentic Bulgarian chant, because Bulgaria in the Middle Ages had its own flowering of kind of indigenous chant and iconography and art. And then it was taken over largely by the Byzantine Empire, and with some, repressive tendencies as these things go. And so that Bulgarian chant and Bulgarian church in general was very Byzantinized or Greek, I don't know what, Greekified, and that these Bulgarian melodies again wound up in Russia. Some of them, by the way, in Carpatho-Russian too. So they might have some of these chanters might have traversed Western Eastern Europe before going to the Eastern Europe. And so you have Kievan chant, Greek chant, Russian Greek chant, Russian Bulgarian chant, and some vestiges of Znamenny that all of which figure in, for example, Tchaikovsky's Vigil.
Now, real quick, before we move on to the vigil, the Znamenny chant. You said there's three forms. There's
Yeah,
the common form, which is also known as Kievan or Obikhod.
or
Is
yeah.
there a name for the middle type that's more syllabic, more complicated, and a name for the melismatic type?
Sometimes the melismatic type is called Great Znamenny chant, Bolshoi,
Okay.
meaning like the Bolshoi theater means the
Mm-hmm.
big theater, right? Bolshoi,
Oh, okay.
Bolshoi. So Bolshoi Znamenny is big melismatic Znamenny. The
Okay.
stuff that has survived to this day, I mean, the Bolshoi version, there are manuscripts and there are copies that have come down to us and that are more or less transcribable. Um, so there are some really quite remarkable pieces of musical uh, artifice there that have come down to us. But uh, the church, interestingly enough, continued to publish. You mentioned square note chant, square note notation, and basically this is staff notation, very similar to Gregorian in its appearance, except the Gregorian has 4 lines, whereas Kievan staff notation has 5 lines. But the musical symbols are very similar in appearance, and these
Okay.
chants, these books containing the complete cycle. And if you're a liturgical musician, you understand what we're talking about. We're talking about the common, the ordinary of the divine liturgy, of vespers, of matins. Then you have the oktoichos, which is the 8 tones, um, the cycle that begins at Easter, Pascha, and then cycles one week every week in a cycle of 8. Uh,
Right.
okay, that's the oktoichos, octo mean 8. Then you have all the feast day hymns, um, and then you have special books for the Lenten period called the Lenten Triodion and the Pentecosterian or the Flowery Triodion, which is the 50 days from Easter to Pentecost. So all these chants, there's 5 volumes of them, and they were published every couple of decades. There would be a new edition of them, and all the way up till right up to the Revolution. I think 1909, 1910 was the last printing. So when Tchaikovsky was interested in uh, doing a chant-based liturgy or vigil, excuse me, he went to some experts and he said, "Well, where do I find these melodies? I want to do something that is Russian. It's not Italian. It's not German. I want to do something that's Russian. It's indigenous." Well, go to any village church, talk to the chanter there, or the psalm singer, as he was called, psalomshchik, uh, and he will show you these books. And so Tchaikovsky said, I did go to the village, I did talk to the chanter, and I found that no one sings those melodies anymore. They're in the
What were they
books.
singing?
Uh, they were trying to imitate what was sung in the capital cities as best as they could, maybe in 3 parts or something like that. There was kind of a simple 3-part harmony. You can imagine, I sing a melody, you sing the third above the melody, and then the bass will kind of jump around 1 4 5 1 on very simple, sometimes most of the time improvised harmony. Uh,
Okay.
that was again, it was a simple kind of singing.
So it was like Carpatho-Russian?
Perhaps, yeah, perhaps. Although I think a little less sophisticated because the Carpatho-Russians have I mean they managed. I've heard services where they sing Znamenny chant in parallel thirds and sometimes in 2 choirs. I mean it's really quite fascinating to listen to. And that's kind of a tradition of its own. But yeah, but Tchaikovsky, so he actually you know drew upon some of these melodies that he found in the square note chant books. that were kind of forgotten and not really used by anybody at the time. And just by virtue of his authority and his reputation, he was kind of jump-started this movement of the new direction in Russian church music. And Tchaikovsky's student was Alexander Kastalsky, and Kastalsky was again considered a major leader stylistically, where he would.
This is Tchaikovsky's student, Kastalski?
Tchaikovsky's student, yes.
Okay.
Tchaikovsky's student Kastalsky, who was a Moscow Conservatory graduate, and when the Moscow Synodal School and its choir were they were kind of given a second life in the 1880s. They were reformed to be a real, not just a training school for chorus choir boys, but to be a real school of choral music, where people would be, think of choral scholars, where they would be highly trained vocalists, and they were responsible for singing the services in the Kremlin cathedrals in Moscow. They were still a state choir. In other words, they were sort of a state-supported private choir. You couldn't, if you had a very talented boy, you couldn't just send him to the Moscow school. Say, well, I want my son to get an excellent choral education. No, he'd have to be somehow recruited and placed in that school, and then all of the direction and all the education was still directed at making that choir, at making him an excellent chorister in that choir. But that choir, one of the ways it's spread its, you could, of course, if you could go to the Kremlin and attend the service, happen to be in Moscow, you could hear the choir. But they also established a practice to give concerts. They would give concerts of sacred music. And this began in about the 1870s and 1880s. And so, again, leading musicians, some of whom perhaps had no specific relations to the church or to church music, could attend these concerts, and new works would be written, especially for performance in these concerts. And so what happened in the 1890s and the early 1900s, right up into the revolution of 1917, there was a very, very rich and forward-looking choral culture that arose in Moscow, and from there were kind of echoes of it in St. Petersburg, and so there was this new direction of choral music, and the stylistically what it meant was that rather than taking a melody and arranging it using the standard Western techniques of, let's say, harmonization or counterpoint, even, that something that was drawn from the Russian polyphonic folk song, because Russian folk choirs tended to sing chorally and heterophonically. In other words, people would be singing the same melody, but they would be improvising what were called counter voices. And so there's this very, very rich sound, and it could be lots of parallel fifths and parallel octaves and
it's
all
sort of
kinds
like the way Gola spirituals are sung, almost.
Voice crossing, all that kind of stuff. All that is what gave us such works as Rachmaninoff's Vigil and Rachmaninoff's liturgies and Chesnikov's works, Kastalsky's Requiem, I'm just kind of naming some of the great
Tell me
great
a little
masterworks.
about Kastalsky, if you don't mind, because I know there's a big recording that was done in the last few years of the Kastalsky Requiem, and
Hmm.
doesn't it quote? Okay, it's been like a year or two since I've listened to it, but wasn't it like "Nearer My God to Thee" or some
Yeah,
other like
yeah, Rock of
super
Ages.
Western Rock
Yeah,
of
yeah.
Ages? Yeah,
Well,
so it's like,
that,
where
yeah.
did
So
that come from?
right. Well, it was called the Requiem for the Fallen Heroes of the Allied armies, and so he specifically set out to write a very, what you might call, eclectic requiem that would draw upon the sacred music traditions of the Allied armies. That would be Russia, France, uh, England, and by the time he started it in 1914, but by the time he finished it, America had already come into World War One, and so he actually met with a delegation of representatives that were sent to Russia to assist the Russians in their war effort. And so he asked them, well, what's typically sung at an American funeral, at an American requiem, if there is such a thing? And somebody told him Rock of Ages, and that's how he integrated Rock of Ages in there. Yeah, it's a very
Interesting.
unusual work, and actually we, I say we because I was kind of involved in it. I brought the score of his Requiem back when I from my research days in Moscow. I was able to get a photographic copy of the score, and that was essentially the world premiere in that particular form, and certainly the Western premiere of that piece. The piece
Amazing.
exists in several. Kostalsky also made an a cappella version that was much more like an Orthodox requiem or memorial service. So that, yeah. And speaking of that piece, it's kind of a one-off. It's very unusual even for Kostalsky. But
Okay.
what Kostalsky is known for is he was really the first. I mean, Tchaikovsky used the chants, but Tchaikovsky's harmony and harmonic treatment of these chants is pretty tame. It's pretty predictable. Um, uh, kind of functional harmony, diatonic for the most part, with occasional chromaticisms when it seemed appropriate to the composer. But it was certainly novel in terms of the number of chants that it used. But Kastalsky came along and said, um, and there are these descriptions written by his students. They said, well, he'll be sitting at his desk working on some manuscript, and his students are gathered around him, and they're following, every movement of the master's pen, and he takes his pen and he kind of he lifts it up in the air and he says, "Now, where do you think we're going to send this alto part? Do you think here? No, we're going to send it here." And he confidently plants his pen into some very unusual place where the voice, isn't the likely thing that you would draw from a Western textbook on harmony and counterpoint. So he was able to create this kind of indigenously Russian folk counterpoint and apply it to sacred pieces, to working on on
And do
on
people
sacred.
still sing that? Like, do they do a lot of the Kastalsky harmonizations of Znamenny?
Yes, 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 they do, but they're very difficult to sing well.
Okay.
So they're challenging pieces. They're not for the kind of simple, day-to-day church choir. We
Interesting.
have a small church choir in our church, you know, 12, 15 singers, and we have a couple of Kostalsky's pieces that we we dare to even attempt.
Okay.
But it's not music for the faint of heart, and it's very easy to do it poorly. in which case it comes across poorly, but very difficult to do well and to really make it shine and sparkle. But Kastalski then inspired a whole bunch of other followers and imitators, and Rachmaninoff in particular, when he was composing his liturgy in 1910, he would send movements to Kastalski for Kastalski's critique and commentary. And there's
Wow.
we even have some of their correspondence that survived, and in one place Kastalski writes, yeah, this chord over here, will it sound good? And Rachmaninoff's rejoinder was, well, I wrote it so it will sound good. Yeah. And then he also inspired, by all indications, the Rachmaninoff's Vigil, which was written 5 years later after the liturgy. And
The
Kastalsky,
liturgy, wasn't that like Tchaikovsky's liturgy? It was
yes, yes. In
uh,
fact, we can,
forbidden.
yeah, well, no, no, it wasn't. It was just, it was freely composed. Very little, not very little, no use of chant in it at
Okay.
all. So
You'd
again,
have
it's
think he
like
would have learned his lesson from Tchaikovsky's
well,
experience.
but then by then
You know,
Tchaikovsky's liturgy was fairly accepted. It depended
really? Okay.
depended on who one talked to, or yeah, if you had some very kind of strict-minded bishop, and he might say to his choir director, "I don't want you singing Tchaikovsky," or that music just isn't appropriate for our worship service.
It's surprising to me that Tchaikovsky, after they went and tore up all of his stuff and threw it in the fire and got rid of it and banned it, then he was like, you know what? I'm going to go back and preserve all the old Russian chant. I feel like if I was Tchaikovsky,
Yeah,
I'd be like, you know what? I'm done with you people. What
yeah,
do you mean you're
yeah,
going to
yeah.
come and throw
Well,
away all my stuff?
well, for whatever it's worth, I mean, you have to read. Tchaikovsky was, a very complex person and had a complicated life in many respects, but uh, he clearly the church had a very important place in his life, and some of his writings, and he wrote letters voluminously to not only to Nadezhda von Meck, who was his patroness, but also to just every person in his life. I mean, you wonder when the man had time to compose or concertize. I mean, he cranked out, like 5 to 10 letters a day, every day, and but you can get a pretty good sense of his mindset from these letters, and where he writes about church and church music. You could tell that it was a subject very close to his heart, and he said, what Russian church music needs is a Messiah that's going to strip away all this foreign accretion and all of this, German and Italian stuff, which some of it was, Bortnyansky was a good composer, but he had a lot of imitators who were not so good composers. And so there was a lot of stuff that was out there that was sort of, second, third rate music. And, but he said, Tchaikovsky said, don't imagine that I mean my own works. He said, this Messiah, that's going to be somebody else. And the general agreement is that was Kastalsky. So
Interesting.
he kind of anointed him in that sense that that he was the one that would show the Russian church, and it was a very very I mean it's a brilliant period in choral music. This was a period in Western Europe. I mean, there was not much choral music being written. It was largely a period of symphonies and operas and instrumental music. And all of a sudden, out of Russia comes this choral school that rivals the choral schools of the Renaissance. Like, where did this come from? And it came to this very fortuitous combination of certain composers and this institution of the Moscow Synodal Choir, the Imperial Chapel. So you had choirs that were open to premiering these pieces when they would appear. And composers like to hear their works performed. So if you're a composer, you're more likely to write if you know that it's going to be performed. Now, Chesnikov, in particular, had his own church choir, and he wrote for his church choir. Wrote the entire cycle of worship music for the Orthodox Church, which isn't insignificant, and he wrote it for that church choir of his.
Wow. That must be a pretty good church choir.
It was a pretty good church choir. We actually have the roster, and we know how many singers he had, and all of that, and we have his diaries. Chesnikov, of course, wrote this remarkable textbook called "The Choir and How to Direct It," which has a very interesting history. He wrote it before the revolution, and he filled it with examples based on his experience, because he was a student at the Synodal School and then the Moscow Conservatory, and he filled it with examples from sacred music. Then the revolution happened, and Chesnikov was told, look, if you want to keep your career as a choral conductor, you have to sever all relations with the church, which had been his life up until that time, which he did. So in 1928, he completely, stopped writing. Well, he's not that he stopped writing church music; he still was writing into the desk drawer, but he relinquished his position as choir master in one of the churches and became full-time at the conservatory. Then he brought his manuscript that he had lovingly crafted on how to direct the choir. It was the first. There were no textbooks on this anywhere in the world, not in the West, not in Russia, on what is a choir and how what kind of instrument is it and how to make it happen. And he was told, okay, this is great, but you have to excise every mention of church music from it. And he tried, and finally in 1940 they published like maybe 100 copies of it in this newly Bowdlerized version, where all mention of sacred music was expunged. And then it saw several more editions. He died in 1944. Well, just last year, there's a publisher in Moscow that published the original version of Chesnikov's book. So we have it now. Of course, the Soviet version was translated by John Romerheim, our colleague from Grinnell College, and we published it at Musica Russica. But it's a different piece of writing than the other one.
So are you going to release the new one?
Well, I just got this copy like a couple of weeks ago, so I have yet to digest it completely myself.
So you need a couple weeks.
Yeah, we need a few weeks, yeah.
Do you like Bach? I know you like Bach. You should buy a copy of my CD, Bach's Klavierübung Dritter Teil, at the Waltershausen Trostorgan, which you can purchase on my website, MatthewWilkinson.net. There is a link below.